Between 1822 and 1824, something happened on a rice plantation near Georgetown, South Carolina, that made even the most hardened overseers refuse to work there. There were 17 documented incidents, 43 unexplained injuries, and one enslaved man whose name was systematically erased from every plantation record. Yet, his actions were whispered about in slave quarters across 3 counties for the next 40 years. The local magistrate's private journal, discovered in 1963, contains a single entry about him. "We have created something we cannot control. God forgive us for what we did to make him this way. What transformed a man into something that terrified the very people who enslaved him? What pain could forge someone so dangerous that his own enslavers tried to erase his existence?" The answer lies buried in the meticulous records of Georgetown's most profitable plantation. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about resistance, survival, and the true cost of cruelty. The story begins not with violence, but with an arrival that seemed ordinary by the brutal standards of 1819. Georgetown, South Carolina, in the spring of that year, was a town that ran on rice and cruelty in equal measure. The Waccamaw River meandered through the low country like a serpent, its banks lined with plantations that produced some of the finest rice in the Americas. The humid air hung thick with the smell of pluff mud and the distant sound of work songs that drifted across the water during the endless growing season. The Fair Haven plantation, owned by Marcus Hewitt, sat on 200 acres of prime bottomland. 300 enslaved people worked its fields, their lives measured in bushels harvested and tasks completed. Hewitt had inherited the property from his father and had built his reputation on 2 things: the exceptional quality of his rice and his equally exceptional cruelty. Other planters whispered that he was too harsh, that his methods bred rebellion, but they couldn't argue with his profit, say 1,000 barrels a year, each one stained with suffering that no ledger could quantify. The overseer, a weathered man named Silas Drummond, had worked for the Hewitt family for 23 years. His face was lined like old leather, his hands scarred from years of wielding the tools of his trade. He prided himself on his ability to manage enslaved people, that peculiar euphemism that meant breaking spirits without breaking bodies too badly to work. He'd seen hundreds of people pass through Fair Haven's gates, and he believed he could measure a person's character within a week. He would be wrong about that. On a humid May morning, a coffle arrived from Charleston. 17 people chained together, their eyes hollow from the 100-mile march. Among them was a man who'd been given the name Samuel by his previous owner. He stood just over 6 feet tall, broad, shouldered from years of labor, with hands that showed the calluses of someone who'd worked iron. The auction records listed him as approximately 26 years old, a trained blacksmith, purchased from the estate of Thomas Radcliffe following bankruptcy. What those records didn't mention was that Samuel had been sold 5 times in 7 years, that each sale had come after unexplained incidents at the previous plantation, that the smile he offered to Drummond during that first inspection contained something other men might have recognized as a warning had they been paying attention. Samuel's wife, Clara, stood beside him in the coffle, her hand gripping his despite the overseer's order not to touch. She was 4 months pregnant, though she'd hidden this fact during the auction by wearing loose clothing. Their 2 children had been sold separately in Charleston, sent to different plantations inland. Samuel had watched them go, his face expressionless, while something inside him had calcified into something harder than the iron he used to forge. Fair Haven's slave quarters consisted of 40 wooden cabins arranged in neat rows behind the main house, each one housing 6 to 8 people. The structures were built from raw pine, already weathered gray by the salt air and rain. Gaps between the boards let in mosquitoes during the warm months and cold during the winter. Samuel and Clara were assigned to cabin 14, sharing the space with 3 other couples and 2 children. The plantation operated on the task system common to low-country rice plantations. Each enslaved person was assigned a specific amount of work to complete each day, a task that typically took 12 to 14 hours during the growing season. Complete your task, and theoretically your time was your own. Failed to complete it, and punishment came swiftly. The system seemed more humane than the gang labor used on cotton plantations, but it was merely cruelty dressed in different clothes. The tasks were calculated to push people to their physical limits day after day, year after year, until their bodies gave out. During those first weeks, Samuel worked in the fields like everyone else, learning the rhythm of rice cultivation. The work was back-breaking, standing ankle, deep in water infected with snakes and alligators, bending thousands of times each day to plant or harvest, breathing air thick with mosquitoes that carried fevers. His blacksmith skills, which had commanded premium prices at auction, went unused. Hewitt had his own blacksmith, an aging man named Joseph, who'd been working Fairhaven's forge for 30 years. Samuel was simply another pair of hands in the fields, another body to extract profit from. But Samuel watched everything. He observed how Drummond moved through the plantation, the routes he took, the times of day he checked on different work areas. He noted which enslaved people held positions of slight authority, the drivers who enforced the overseer's orders, the domestic servants who heard conversations in the main house. He watched how punishments were administered, how resistance was crushed, how hope was systematically extracted from people until they became the walking dead, and he waited. Clara grew weaker as her pregnancy progressed. The fieldwork and inadequate food took their toll. She tried to hide her condition as long as possible, knowing that pregnant women were sometimes given lighter tasks, but were also viewed as less valuable, more likely to be sold away. When her pregnancy became impossible to conceal, Drummond reduced her task slightly, but added insult to the small mercy by assigning her to collect night soil from the main house, work considered particularly degrading. On a sweltering July evening, as Samuel and Clara sat outside their cabin after the day's work, she spoke softly about the children they'd lost. "I dream about them," she said, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "I dream that Thomas still remembers the song I used to sing to him, that little Mary remembers my face." Her voice caught. "But they'll forget us, won't they? They'll grow up, and we'll just be ghosts to them." Samuel didn't answer. His hands gripped his knees, knuckles white, and his jaw worked as if he were chewing on words too dangerous to speak aloud. In that moment, something shifted behind his eyes. A calculation was being made, a decision taking shape in the darkness of his thoughts. The incident that changed everything happened 3 weeks later on a Monday morning, when the heat already shimmered off the rice fields at dawn. Clara collapsed while carrying water to the field workers. The pregnancy had weakened her more than she'd admitted, and the combination of heat, poor nutrition, and exhaustion simply overwhelmed her body. She lay in the mud between the rows of rice, unconscious, while the other workers gathered around her. Drummond arrived within minutes, summoned by one of the drivers. He looked down at Clara's prone form with the expression of a man calculating the cost of a damaged tool. "Get her to the sick house," he ordered, "but her task still needs completing. Samuel, you'll finish her work today on top of your own, or you'll both taste the lash tomorrow." Samuel stood perfectly still for 3 long seconds. The other workers stepped back, recognizing something in his posture that Drummond, in his arrogance, failed to notice. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "No." That single word fell into the humid air like a stone into still water. Drummond's face flushed red. In 23 years of working plantations, he'd heard enslaved people plead, bargain, weep, and scream, but outright refusal was rare enough to be shocking. "What did you say to me?" "I said no." Samuel's eyes met Drummond's without wavering. "You'll tend to my wife properly. You'll call for the doctor. You'll make sure she and the child survive, and I'll finish both our tasks." The audacity of it stunned Drummond into momentary silence. An enslaved man didn't make demands, didn't negotiate, didn't speak to an overseer as if they were equals discussing terms. The proper response was immediate, brutal punishment to reestablish the natural order. But something in Samuel's stillness made Drummond hesitate. Some instinct that whispered this was different, that this man was different. "You're speaking mighty bold for someone who can be whipped within an inch of his life for that tone," Drummond said, trying to reassert control through threat. "You can whip me," Samuel agreed, his voice still eerily calm. "You can whip me until the flesh falls from my bones, but Clara gets proper care first, or I don't work another day on this plantation, not another minute, not another second. You can beat me to death, but you'll get no more labor from me, and Mr. Hewitt will want to know why his property suddenly became worthless." It was masterful psychological warfare, framing the ultimatum in terms of Hewitt's financial interests rather than mercy or justice. Drummond's face worked through several expressions: rage, confusion, calculation. Finally, he spat into the dirt. "Fine, I'll send for the doctor, but you'll work double tasks for a week after this. And if you fail even one, you and your wife both feel the consequences." Samuel nodded once, sharply, and turned to lift Clara gently from the mud. As he carried her toward the sick house, the other workers parted before him like water. They'd witnessed something unprecedented. A man who'd stared down an overseer and won, however temporarily. The whispers began that very day. The doctor came, a young man named Patterson, who rode out from Georgetown that afternoon, more interested in his fee than in his patient. He examined Clara in the sick house, a drafty structure that held 6 rough beds and smelled of old sickness. His examination was cursory, but his conclusion was definitive. She needs complete bed rest for at least a week, proper nutrition, and no physical labor until after the child is born. The pregnancy is at risk. If you work her, you'll lose both mother and baby. Drummond took this information to Marcus Hewitt that evening. The plantation owner listened to the report while sipping whiskey on his veranda, watching the sun set over his fields. Hewitt was 42 years old, thin, lipped and calculating, a man who viewed enslaved people as livestock, requiring proper management to maximize returns. The loss of a woman and a potential child represented a significant financial setback, but accommodating her needs created its own problems. Let her rest for a week, Hewitt decided, but Samuel fulfills both tasks daily or faces punishment. Make it clear this is a one-time accommodation. We cannot have others thinking pregnancy earns them special treatment. What happened over the next week became the subject of stories told in slave quarters across the Low Country for decades afterward. Samuel did the impossible. Every morning before dawn, he went to the fields and completed his own task, a full day's work of rice cultivation that would exhaust any man. Then, as the sun climbed toward noon, he began Clara's task. Other workers watched in awe as he maintained a pace that should have killed him. His hands bled, his back screamed, sweat poured from him in streams that left dark puddles in the mud, but he finished. Every single day, he finished both tasks. On the third day, something strange began happening. As Samuel worked alone in the section of field assigned as Clara's task, other enslaved people started drifting over during their brief rest periods. They didn't speak. Speech would draw the attention of the overseers, but they worked, 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there, a row of rice planted while pretending to adjust a tool, weeds pulled while apparently resting in the shade. It was collective resistance so subtle that the overseers failed to notice it, but it made the difference between Samuel's survival and his collapse. Drummond did notice, though. On the fourth day, he watched from a distance as Samuel received this covert assistance, and his face darkened with understanding. This was the thing overseers feared most: enslaved people acting in concert, building networks of solidarity that undermined the isolation each person was supposed to feel. One defiant man was manageable. A community beginning to organize itself, even in small ways, was dangerous. That evening, Drummond went to cabin 14 and ordered Samuel outside. 3 other overseers waited there, holding torches that cast dancing shadows across the quarters. The message was clear. This would be a public lesson. You've been getting help in the fields. Drummond said, that wasn't part of our arrangement. You said you'd do both tasks yourself. I have done both tasks, Samuel replied carefully. Every evening you've inspected my work and Clara's work and found both complete. Whatever help I received was freely given during other people's own time after their tasks were finished. You have no grounds for complaint. It was true, and Drummond knew it. The task system's logic worked against him here. If someone completed their assigned work, their remaining time was theoretically their own. But Drummond wasn't interested in logic. He was interested in re-establishing dominance. Strip your shirt, Drummond ordered. Samuel hesitated for the first time since this ordeal began. Around them, people emerged from cabins, drawn by the commotion. Clara appeared in the doorway of cabin 14, one hand braced against the frame, her face pale but her eyes fierce. Samuel looked at her, then slowly removed his shirt. His back bore the scars of previous beatings, some old and faded, others more recent. These were the permanent marks of enslavement, the physical records of a lifetime of being someone else's property. Drummond examined those scars by torchlight, then pulled out his whip, a braided leather thing that had tasted hundreds of backs. This isn't about the work, Drummond said quietly, speaking loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. This is about remembering your place, about understanding that we decide when you've earned mercy, not you. The first lash cut across Samuel's shoulders, raising a welt that immediately began to bleed. Samuel didn't cry out. The second blow landed, then the third. Still, Samuel stood silent, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw locked tight. By the 10th blow, Drummond was breathing hard from exertion and frustration. Enslaved people were supposed to scream, to beg, to be broken by this. Samuel's silence was its own form of resistance, and everyone watching understood this. Kneel, Drummond ordered. Samuel remained standing. I said, kneel. Drummond's voice cracked with anger. You can beat me until I can't stand. Samuel said, his voice steady despite the pain that must have been coursing through him. But I won't kneel, not for you. Not for any man who thinks he owns me. The crowd of watchers drew in a collective breath. This was sedition of the most dangerous kind, not violent rebellion, but philosophical rejection of the entire system. Drummond raised his whip for another blow, but a voice stopped him. That's enough, Silas. Marcus Hewitt emerged from the darkness beyond the torchlight, having been summoned by a domestic servant who'd witnessed the confrontation beginning. Hewitt approached Samuel slowly, studying him with the expression of someone examining an interesting specimen. You're quite remarkable, Hewitt said conversationally. In my experience, pride like yours is either beaten out of a man or it consumes him entirely. Which do you suppose will happen to you? Samuel met his eyes without flinching. I reckon time will tell, sir. Hewitt actually smiled at that. Indeed it will. Silas, that's sufficient punishment for now. Samuel has fulfilled his obligations. His wife may rest for the remainder of the week as the doctor ordered. He turned to address the crowd. All of you back to your cabins, and remember this. Mercy is given at our discretion, not demanded as a right. We are generous when we choose to be, but that generosity can be withdrawn just as easily. As the crowd dispersed, Hewitt leaned close to Samuel and spoke in a voice only he could hear. You have something that worries me, intelligence and will. That's a dangerous combination in a slave. I'll be watching you very carefully from now on, and trust me when I say you don't want my attention. Clara gave birth 6 weeks later on an October morning, when the first hints of autumn finally began to cool the oppressive heat. The child was a girl, born healthy despite all the hardships her mother had endured. They named her Ruth, and for a brief time, something like hope flickered in that cabin. Samuel held his daughter with a tenderness that seemed at odds with the hardness that had grown in him. and Clara sang the same lullabies she'd once sung to the children they'd lost. But hope proved fragile in a place like Fair Haven. In November, Joseph, the plantation's blacksmith, died suddenly of a fever that swept through the quarters. The old man had trained no replacement, and Fair Haven's blacksmith shop stood empty at a time when hundreds of tools needed maintenance and repair. The rice harvest had dulled countless hoes and sickles. Plow blades needed resharpening. Iron hinges and locks throughout the plantation required attention. Marcus Hewitt remembered that Samuel had been advertised as a trained blacksmith. 2 days after Joseph's death, Samuel was reassigned from fieldwork to the forge. On the surface, this seemed like an improvement. Blacksmith work was skilled labor conducted under a roof, theoretically less physically punishing than rice cultivation. But Hewitt wasn't motivated by mercy. He needed a blacksmith, and Samuel's defiance weeks earlier had marked him as someone requiring close supervision. The forge sat just 50 yards from the main house, with an easy view of Hewitt's study window. Samuel approached the forge on his first morning with mixed feelings. Metal work had been his trade before the endless cycle of sales that had eventually brought him to Fair Haven. He'd learned the craft in Virginia, apprenticed to a skilled blacksmith who treated him with something approaching respect. The work had given him a sense of purpose, a way to create rather than simply toil. But that was before Thomas and Mary had been torn from his arms, before Clara had collapsed in the fields, before 10 lashes had stripped skin from his back, while Drummond tried to break his spirit. The forge itself was a sturdy brick structure with a high roof to vent smoke and heat. The bellows were well maintained, the anvil solid, the tools organized and comprehensive. Joseph had been a meticulous craftsman, and his workspace reflected that. Samuel ran his hand along the anvil's surface, feeling the countless tiny dents and scratches that recorded years of work. In another life, this would have been a sanctuary. He started slowly, reacquainting himself with the rhythms of the trade, fire management, building the coal bed to the right temperature, learning the forge's particular quirks. Metal selection, understanding which pieces of scrap iron could be reworked and which were too brittle or flawed. Tool repair, reshaping the damaged implements that had been accumulating since Joseph's death. The work consumed him, providing a temporary escape from the rage that simmered beneath his surface. Drummond checked on him regularly, suspicious of any activity he couldn't fully control, but there was little to observe. Just a man working metal, sweat gleaming on his skin as he hammered hot iron into useful shapes. What Drummond failed to notice were the small items Samuel created during the brief moments when he wasn't working on plantation business. A thin metal file small enough to hide in a sleeve, a carefully shaped wedge that could pry open a locked door or window. Small pieces of iron wrought into shapes that might serve purposes beyond what any overseer could imagine. December brought colder weather and the end of the harvest season, a time when enslaved people were typically given a few days of relative rest before the cycle began again. Hewitt, in keeping with common plantation practice, announced that Christmas would include 3 days without field labor, along with extra rations of food and a small amount of liquor for the adults. These brief holidays served a cynical purpose. They gave enslaved people just enough relief to prevent total despair, while reinforcing the idea that any mercy came from the master's generosity rather than being a right. On Christmas Eve, Hewitt called Samuel to the main house. This summons sent ripples of anxiety through the quarters. Being called to the house usually meant punishment, special assignment, or bad news. Clara watched her husband walk across the yard with her hand pressed to her mouth, Ruth sleeping against her shoulder. Samuel found Hewitt in his study, a comfortable room lined with books and furnished with dark wood furniture shipped from England. The plantation owner sat behind a massive desk, examining papers by lamplight. He didn't look up when Samuel entered, closed the door. Hewitt said. Samuel did so, his mind racing through possibilities. The silence stretched out for nearly a minute before Hewitt finally set down his papers and fixed his gaze on Samuel. "Do you know why I brought you here?" Hewitt asked. "No, sir. I wanted to have a conversation, an honest one, between two intelligent men." Hewitt leaned back in his chair. "You're educated, Samuel. I can see it in the way you speak, the way you think. Someone taught you to read, didn't they, before you were sold the first time?" Samuel said nothing, knowing that literacy among enslaved people was illegal in South Carolina and could result in severe punishment. Hewitt waved his hand dismissively. "I don't care about that. What interests me is understanding you. In my years managing this plantation, I've encountered many types of slaves, the ones who are broken from birth, who accept their lot without question, the ones who are broken by experience, whose spirits are crushed gradually, ones who resist openly and are destroyed for it. And then there are the rare ones like you, people who don't break, who maintain some core of selfhood despite everything we do to strip it away. You fascinate me because you should have been crushed years ago, and yet here you stand unbroken." "Is there a question in all that, sir?" Samuel asked carefully. "Yes. What would it take to make you accept your position? What would I have to do to transform you from a potential problem into a productive, docile worker?" The question hung in the air between them. Samuel understood he was being tested, that his answer mattered in ways he couldn't fully predict. He chose his words with precision. "You're asking the wrong question, sir. You can't make me accept slavery because acceptance would require believing I deserve to be enslaved, and I know I don't. Neither does my wife. Neither did my children before you people sold them away from me. You can force obedience through violence. You can extract labor through threats. But you can't make anyone accept the fundamental injustice of owning another human being. The most you can hope for is that we pretend to accept it while we survive." Hewitt studied him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He smiled. "That's precisely the answer I hoped you'd give, because it confirms my assessment of you. You're dangerous, Samuel, not because you're violent. Violence is easy to control. You're dangerous because you see clearly, because you understand exactly what this system is, and you refuse to internalize the lie that it's natural or right. Men like you are the reason we have patrols and laws and constant vigilance. You're the nightmare that keeps plantation owners awake at night. If you think I'm so dangerous, why not just sell me?" Samuel asked. "Because danger can be useful if properly directed." Hewitt stood and walked to the window, looking out over his property. "I have a proposition for you. You'll continue working as my blacksmith. You'll train several others in the trade so I'm not dependent on a single person. In exchange, I'll ensure Clara receives lighter work assignments appropriate for a nursing mother. I'll provide your cabin with extra rations. And I'll promise you this, as long as you cause me no trouble, I will not sell you, Clara, or Ruth separately. Your family stays together." The offer was clever because it exploited the one vulnerability Samuel couldn't armor against: his love for his family. The promise of keeping them together was exactly the kind of incentive that might transform a potential rebel into a compliant worker. Hewitt was offering a devil's bargain, submission in exchange for the thing Samuel wanted most. "And if I refuse this generous offer?" Samuel asked. "Then I sell Clara and Ruth south, Georgia or Alabama, where you'll never see them again, and you remain here working my forge with nothing but memories and regret to keep you company. You'd become exactly what I need you to be anyway, but you'd have lost everything in the process." Samuel felt the trap close around him. This wasn't really an offer. It was coercion dressed in the language of negotiation. But what choice did he have? He could refuse on principle and lose his family, or accept the deal and retain some small sphere of safety for them. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "I accept your terms," Samuel said quietly. "Excellent." Hewitt returned to his desk and made a note in his ledger. "You'll start training others after the new year, and Samuel, don't mistake this arrangement for friendship or respect. You're still my property. This is simply good business, keeping valuable assets productive. Dismiss yourself." Samuel left the study and walked back across the dark yard to cabin 14. Clara met him at the door, her eyes full of questions. He told her about the arrangement, about the protection it offered, and the price it demanded. They held each other in the darkness while Ruth slept nearby, and neither of them spoke about the fact that they'd just accepted chains slightly longer than before, but chains nonetheless. The new year of 1820 began with unusual cold that froze the shallow waters of the rice fields and made the work of preparing for spring planting even more miserable. Samuel spent his days in the relative warmth of the forge, training 3 other enslaved men in the basics of blacksmithing. He taught them methodically fire management, metal properties, basic tool repair, the maintenance of edges and points. The men learned quickly, motivated by the knowledge that this skilled work might save them from the brutal field work that destroyed bodies. But while Samuel's hands worked the forge, his mind worked through a different kind of calculation. The arrangement with Hewitt had bought his family temporary security, but it hadn't changed the fundamental reality of their enslavement. Clara's lighter work assignment could be revoked at any moment. The promise not to sell them separately meant nothing if Hewitt decided to sell them together, or if financial pressures forced a sale, or if Hewitt simply died and they became part of his estate's liquidation. The illusion of security was just that, an illusion. Samuel began to pay attention to things he'd previously ignored. The patrol routes taken by the white men who rode through the area at night, enforcing curfews and hunting for runaways. The schedule of supply deliveries to the plantation. The comings and goings of traders and visitors to Georgetown. The network of roads that connected the plantation to the wider world. He didn't have a specific plan yet, but he was gathering information the way a blacksmith gathers raw materials, not knowing exactly what he'll build, but knowing he'll need resources when the time comes. In February, a man arrived at Fair Haven who would inadvertently provide the catalyst for everything that followed. His name was William Sterling, and he was a slave trader passing through Georgetown on his way north to Virginia. He stopped at Fair Haven to conduct some business with Hewitt, the sale of 3 enslaved people who'd been deemed troublesome on other plantations. Sterling was in his 50s, prosperous and confident, a man who'd built his fortune on human suffering without apparent conscience. Samuel was working at the forge when Sterling rode up to examine the blacksmith's operation. The trader had brought his own blacksmith to look at the setup, considering whether to invest in establishing a similar operation at his holding facility in Richmond. The 2 men stood watching Samuel work for several minutes before Sterling spoke. "You do fine work," he said. "Where'd you learn the trade?" "Virginia, sir," Samuel replied, not looking up from the plowshare he was repairing. "Apprenticed to a smith in Fredericksburg before I was sold south." Fredericksburg. Sterling's interest sharpened. "What was your master's name back then?" Something in the trader's tone made Samuel pause. He looked up and found Sterling studying him with an expression that combined recognition and calculation. A cold feeling settled in Samuel's stomach. "I don't recall, sir," Samuel lied. "That was many years ago." But Sterling's face had already shifted into certainty. "I do recall, though. Thomas Radcliffe wasn't it, and you weren't just his blacksmith. You were the one involved in that incident with his son, the boy who died in the stable fire." The forge suddenly felt very small. Samuel's grip tightened on the hammer he was holding, and for a moment the world reduced to the sound of his own heartbeat. That fire had happened 8 years ago. Radcliffe's teenage son, drunk and vicious, had come to the forge one night and attacked Samuel with a riding crop, screaming abuse about some perceived insult. There had been a struggle. A lantern had fallen. The fire had spread faster than anyone anticipated, consuming the stable and trapping the boy inside before help could arrive. Samuel had been the only witness to what happened, and his testimony as an enslaved man counted for nothing in any legal proceeding, but suspicions had swirled. Radcliffe had sold Samuel within a week, eager to remove any reminder of his son's death. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," Samuel said carefully. Sterling smiled, and it was the smile of a man who just discovered leverage. "Of course you don't, But memories are funny things, aren't they? They have a way of surfacing at inconvenient times. I wonder what Mr. Hewitt would think if he knew his valuable blacksmith had such an interesting history. The threat was clear. Sterling had information that could destroy the fragile stability Samuel had built. If Hewitt learned about the fire and the suspicions surrounding it, he'd sell Samuel immediately. No owner wanted someone who might be a danger to his family or property. And Sterling knew this, was calculating how to profit from this knowledge. That evening, Sterling had dinner with Hewitt at the main house. Samuel didn't know what was discussed, but the next morning, Hewitt summoned him again. "Mr. Sterling has made me aware of some concerning information about your past," Hewitt said without preamble. "He's also made me an offer. He'll pay top dollar to purchase you and take you back to Virginia, where apparently you're wanted for questioning about a fire that killed a white boy." Samuel's blood turned to ice. "I had nothing to do with that boy's death, sir. An accident, perhaps, but the law in Virginia might see it differently. Sterling seems to think they would." Hewitt paused. "However, I've declined his offer. You're too valuable to me as a blacksmith, and I don't make business decisions based on old rumors. But understand this, if you give me any reason to regret keeping you, if you cause any trouble whatsoever, I will sell you to Sterling without hesitation. Your family stays here, and you go north to face whatever awaits you there." The new threat hung over Samuel like a blade. Sterling remained in Georgetown for 3 more days conducting his business, and Samuel knew the traitor was simply waiting for Hewitt to change his mind. Every moment felt precarious, as if the ground beneath his feet might give way at any second. On Sterling's last night in Georgetown, something happened that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. The trader accepted an invitation to dine with several prominent plantation owners at a tavern in town, a social gathering that included Hewitt and 2 other major landowners. These men drank whiskey and discussed business and politics late into the evening, their voices growing louder as the alcohol flowed. Samuel learned about this gathering the next day from a domestic servant named Rachel, who'd been working at the tavern that night. She told the story in whispers to a small group in the quarters, her voice tight with anger. Sterling had been boasting about his success in the slave trade, telling stories about his methods for breaking difficult cases. He described in detail how he handled enslaved people who showed too much spirit or intelligence, techniques involving isolation, strategic violence, and psychological torture designed to destroy the will to resist. But what made Rachel's hands shake as she told this story was Sterling's account of a woman he'd purchased in Charleston the previous year. A woman traveling with 2 children, a boy about 5 and a girl about 3. Sterling had described separating the woman from her children, selling them to different buyers in Georgia, watching the mother's spirit break as she was loaded onto a ship bound for Cuba. He'd laughed while telling this story, describing her screams as entertainment. The description matched Samuel and Clara's children perfectly. The ages, the timing, the location of the sale. When Samuel heard this story, something inside him that had been bent finally snapped. He walked to the forge in a daze, his mind replaying Sterling's words as Rachel had reported them. His children sold away and scattered like seeds in the wind, their fates unknown and likely terrible. Their mother separated from them and sent to Cuba, where slavery was even more brutal than in the American South, and Sterling laughing about it over whiskey, treating their suffering as an entertaining anecdote. Samuel stood in the forge for a long time, staring at the fire without seeing it. Then he began to work. His hands moved with purpose now, creating something specific. Over the next 4 hours, working late into the night, long after everyone else had gone to their cabins, he forged something he'd been thinking about for months, but had never allowed himself to actually make. It was a key, or rather, 3 keys, each one carefully shaped to match the locks he'd been studying since his arrival at Fair Haven. One for the plantation's storage shed, where extra tools and supplies were kept. One for the tack room where bridles and saddles hung, and one for the door of the smokehouse, which sat close to the perimeter of the plantation grounds. He made them small, easy to conceal, and he tested each one in its lock during the following days, working during the brief moments when no one was watching. Samuel had no specific plan for escape. The odds of successfully fleeing South Carolina were minimal. The penalties for being caught were horrific, and attempting it meant abandoning Clara and Ruth. But he needed to know he could move freely if circumstances demanded it. He needed some small measure of control in a situation designed to strip away all agency. What came next wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, methodical, and all the more terrifying for its calculated nature. The first incident happened on a March evening, 3 weeks after Sterling's departure. Drummond discovered that his favorite riding crop, a particular piece of braided leather he used for both horses and punishments, had gone missing from the tack room. He flew into a rage, certain that one of the enslaved people had stolen it as an act of petty rebellion. He ordered a search of the quarters, turning over bedding and belongings while people stood by helplessly. The crop was never found. A week later, Marcus Hewitt's hunting dog, a valuable pointer he'd imported from England, was found dead in its kennel. The death appeared natural. The dog was old and had been slowing down for months, but Hewitt insisted on having a veterinarian examine the animal. The veterinarian found nothing definitive, but mentioned that some of the symptoms were consistent with consuming oleander, a toxic plant that grew wild around the plantation. 2 weeks after that, Drummond fell ill with a stomach ailment that left him bedridden for 3 days. The doctor diagnosed it as something he'd eaten, perhaps spoiled meat, but the cook swore that all the food served to the overseers had been fresh and no one else had gotten sick from the same meal. Each incident in isolation seemed unremarkable, the normal accidents and misfortunes that occur on any plantation, but taken together they formed a pattern that made Hewitt uneasy. He began to suspect deliberate sabotage, though he had no evidence and no clear suspect. He increased patrols, imposed stricter curfews, and watched his enslaved workers with heightened suspicion. Samuel continued his work at the forge, training his apprentices, maintaining his routine. But those who knew him well noticed subtle changes. Clara saw how he sometimes stared into the fire with an expression that frightened her. Rachel observed him working late into the night more frequently, the hammer blows ringing out long after everyone else had sought rest. The other men in cabin 14 remarked on how he'd sometimes wake in the darkness and sit perfectly still for hours, as if engaged in silent communion with something they couldn't see. In May, a traveling preacher arrived in Georgetown, a Methodist minister named Reverend Thompson, who made regular circuits through the Low Country, preaching to both white and enslaved congregations. Hewitt, like many plantation owners, permitted and even encouraged these religious visits, believing that Christianity made enslaved people more docile and accepting of their condition. On a Sunday morning, Thompson preached to Fair Haven's enslaved community in an open area near the quarters. His sermon was drawn from Exodus, the story of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt and their eventual liberation. Thompson was careful in his presentation, emphasizing obedience and patience, framing the message in ways designed not to inspire rebellion. But the story itself was inherently subversive. It was about enslaved people who'd suffered until God intervened to free them, about a tyrant who'd oppressed them facing divine punishment, about a long journey to freedom through wilderness and hardship.